Before we begin, please be aware this story contains themes of mystery and psychological suspense that some listeners may find intense. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer. An unassuming envelope, cream-colored with no return address. But it wasn't just the lack of a sender that made Emily Miller's blood run cold. It was the handwriting. Each character, a meticulous dance of ink, was so perfectly formed it looked less like a personal script and more like a carefully crafted typeface. It was elegant, almost calligraphic, yet beneath its flawless precision, Emily felt an unsettling rigidity, a tension that seemed to hum from the very fibers of the paper. Emily, a graphic designer in her late 20s, possessed an eye for detail, an almost subconscious ability to dissect visual information. She noticed the subtle imperfections in printed text, the way a logo's curves could betray its hurried design, or how a single pixel could throw off an entire composition. This letter, however, defied her usual observations. It was too perfect, too consistent, as if every stroke had been measured, calculated, and executed with an unnerving degree of control. It felt less like a message and more like a carefully constructed artifact. She turned the envelope over in her hands, her brow furrowing. The address, her own, was written with the same chilling precision. Emily Miller, 1422, Elmwood Drive, Willow Creek, California. Not her parents' address, not a previous residence. Hers. She'd only lived in this quaint Victorian house for 3 years, having inherited it from her great-aunt Susan. The house itself held its own quiet history, but this letter felt like an intrusion from a much deeper, far more shadowed past. Her initial thought was a prank. Maybe a colleague, knowing her fascination with typography, was playing a clever joke. But the paper felt old, almost brittle, and the faint earthy scent clinging to it wasn't the fresh smell of printer ink. It was the smell of forgotten things, of dust and time. With a growing sense of unease, Emily slid her thumb under the flap. There was no resistance. The adhesive had long since dried and cracked. Inside, a single sheet of heavy parchment paper lay folded neatly. It wasn't a letter in the traditional sense, no greeting, no body, no closing. Just a series of seemingly random characters, meticulously arranged in 3 distinct lines. The first line was a sequence of numbers, 713225189147120. The second, a string of uppercase letters, XJPMZRKQLT. And the third, a strange, almost forgotten symbol. It looked like a jagged angularum with an arrow piercing its center, pointing downwards. Emily stared at it, a faint prickle of recognition dancing at the edge of her memory. She'd seen it somewhere before, perhaps in a book on ancient runes or obscure heraldry, but the exact context eluded her. She laid the sheet flat on her kitchen table, the parchment crinkling softly. The silence in the house suddenly felt magnified, heavy with unspoken questions. Who would send something like this? What was it? And why to her? Emily tried to rationalize it. A wrong delivery, perhaps? But her name and address were undeniably clear. A coded message? The numerical sequence certainly pointed in that direction, as did the string of seemingly random letters. But a code for what? A scavenger hunt? A puzzle box left by an eccentric relative? Her great-aunt Susan had been a bit of an enigma, a woman who collected curiosities and spoke in riddles, but Susan had passed away 5 years ago. This letter felt far older than anything Susan might have left behind. Then, her gaze fell upon the postmark. It was faded, almost illegible, but with a slight tilt of the paper in the afternoon light, the date became horrifyingly clear. October 14, 1972. 1972. Emily's breath caught in her throat. 51 years ago. How was that possible? A letter postmarked over half a century ago, arriving in her mailbox today, addressed specifically to her? It defied logic, defied the very laws of physics. She meticulously checked the postmark again, rubbing her thumb over the faint ink, as if to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a manufacturing defect on the envelope. But no, the year was unmistakable. The small circular stamp, the postal code, even the slightly blurred image of the eagle, all pointed to a bygone era. A chill far colder than the unseasonably cool autumn air snaked its way down her spine. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else entirely. Something impossible. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments. A delayed letter? 50 years was an absurd delay. A letter found and remailed? But who would do that, and why address it to her, someone who wouldn't be born for another decade after the original postmark date. Or was it possible the sender knew somehow that she would eventually occupy this house, that she would be the one to receive this message half a century in the future? The thought was terrifying in its implication, suggesting a level of foresight that bordered on the supernatural. Emily pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she instinctively typed the jagged M symbol into a search engine. She described its features: angular M arrow through middle downward symbol. The results were a dizzying array of historical symbols, alchemical notations, and obscure cult imagery. Nothing immediately clicked, but she felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a random doodle, it was a deliberate mark, a signature of some kind. She pulled up a browser tab for common ciphers. The number sequence 713225189147120 looked like a simple substitution cipher, where each number corresponded to a letter of the alphabet: 1 equals A, 2 equals B, etc. She quickly jotted it down. Jimvoranjt. Bimvirangat, she whispered aloud. It made no sense. It wasn't a word, or even a recognizable anagram. Her initial excitement at cracking a piece of the puzzle quickly deflated into confusion. It had to be wrong. This wasn't a simple cipher, or perhaps it was part of a larger, more complex one. Then she looked at the second line of letters. XJPMZRKQL 10 letters. The same number of characters as the numerical sequence. Could they be related? Was one a key to the other? The longer she stared at the parchment, the more she felt an invisible weight pressing down on her. This wasn't just a puzzle. It felt like an invitation, or a warning. The meticulous care, the impossible postmark, the deliberately cryptic content. It all pointed to a sender who wanted this message to be found, to be deciphered, and to have a profound impact on its recipient. And that recipient, for some unfathomable reason, was her. Emily found herself glancing towards the windows, towards the familiar, quiet street outside. The afternoon sun filtered through the old oak trees, casting dappled shadows on her kitchen floor. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but the letter on her table had shattered that peace, introducing an element of profound mystery, a whisper from the past demanding her attention. She felt a flicker of fear, a primal instinct to throw the letter away, to pretend it had never arrived, to return to her ordinary life, to her design projects and her evening runs through the park. But the graphic designer in her, the part of her that thrived on solving visual riddles, refused to let go. There was a story here, a hidden narrative waiting to be uncovered, and for some inexplicable reason, she was now a part of it. The symbol, the jagged M with the arrow, kept drawing her eye. It felt like a brand, a mark of ownership or a declaration. And the date, 1972. What was happening in Willow Creek, California, in 1972 that would lead to a coded letter being sent to someone who wouldn't exist for another decade, only to arrive half a century later? The questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. Emily picked up the parchment again, feeling its dry, brittle texture. It was a tangible link to a distant past, a past that had somehow reached out across time to tap her on the shoulder. This wasn't just a letter, it was a challenge, a carefully constructed enigma designed to unravel a secret, or perhaps, to reveal a truth that someone desperately wanted hidden. And she had a terrifying feeling that once she started pulling at this thread, she might uncover something far darker and more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. The mystery had arrived, and it had her name on it. The mystery had arrived, and it had her name on it. Amelia clutched the faded, brittle letter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The antique parchment felt strangely cool in her trembling hands, a stark contrast to the sudden heat that had flushed her cheeks. Her grandmother, Eleanor, sweet, unassuming Eleanor, who had always seemed to live a life of quiet routines and predictable comfort. What secrets could she possibly have harbored that warranted such an enigmatic, almost cryptic message? The letter itself was a marvel of aged elegance. The paper, a thick, cream-colored stock, was rough to the touch, bearing the faint scent of old books and forgotten lavender. The handwriting, a delicate, looping script, was undoubtedly Eleanor's, yet it held an unusual tension, a hurried quality Amelia had never seen in her grandmother's otherwise meticulous penmanship. But it wasn't just the script that seized her attention. It was the symbols, scattered seemingly at random among the lines of seemingly innocuous pleasantries about garden roses and the weather, were a series of peculiar glyphs. They weren't letters, not numbers, Not even conventional punctuation marks. They were intricate, almost artistic designs. A small stylized eye with a single tear, a broken compass rose, a spiraling seashell, a tiny segmented insect, each one meticulously drawn, almost etched onto the paper. They appeared in clusters, sometimes replacing a word, sometimes standing alone between sentences, creating a visual rhythm that was both unsettling and utterly captivating. It was as if Eleanor had embedded a secret language within plain sight, a silent conversation meant only for a specific recipient, or perhaps for a specific moment in time. Amelia's mind raced, trying to recall every conversation, every anecdote, every quiet moment she'd shared with Eleanor. Had there ever been a hint, a flicker of something beneath the surface? Eleanor had been a history buff, certainly, with a particular fondness for local lore and forgotten tales, but never had she given any indication of dabbling in cryptography or secret societies. The idea was absurd, yet the evidence lay undeniable in her hands. She spent the entire evening hunched over the kitchen table, the letter spread out beneath the harsh glare of the overhead light. She tried everything. She held it up to the light, searching for watermarks or hidden text. She tried folding it in different ways, hoping to align the symbols into a discernible pattern. She even, in a moment of desperate inspiration, tried shining a UV light on it, a trick she'd once seen in a movie. Nothing. The symbols remained stubbornly opaque, defiantly refusing to yield their meaning. Each intricate drawing seemed to mock her, a silent challenge from beyond the grave. The more she stared, the more a chilling realization began to creep in. These symbols weren't just decorative flourishes. They were too precise, too deliberate. They were a code. And if they were a code, then the seemingly innocent words around them were merely a carefully constructed camouflage, a whisper in the wind designed to distract from the true message. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. What kind of message would Eleanor have needed to hide so meticulously? By midnight, exhaustion had set in, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one spiraling into another, more unsettling query. She knew she couldn't tackle this alone. She needed a fresh pair of eyes, a different perspective. Her thoughts immediately turned to Sarah Miller. Sarah, her oldest friend, a graphic designer with an uncanny knack for patterns and an insatiable curiosity for puzzles of all kinds. If anyone could help her unravel this, it was Sarah. The next morning, Amelia drove straight to Sarah's apartment, the letter carefully tucked into a protective sleeve in her bag. Sarah, a perpetually vibrant woman with a riot of fiery red curls and an infectious laugh, answered the door, a half-eaten bagel in hand. "Amelia, to what do I owe this early morning mystery visit?" Sarah grinned, but her smile faltered as she saw the unusual intensity in Amelia's eyes. "Whoa, you look like you've seen a ghost. Or solved a murder. Which is it?" Amelia bypassed the pleasantries. "Worse, maybe. I found something in Grandma Eleanor's things. Something unexpected." She pulled out the letter, unfolding it carefully on Sarah's small coffee table. Sarah leaned in, her playful expression slowly morphing into one of focused intrigue. Her fingers, usually adorned with an array of colorful rings, traced the delicate script, then paused at the first cluster of symbols. "Wow," Sarah breathed, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "This is not your average grocery list, is it? The paper alone is ancient. And these are beautiful. And utterly baffling." Sarah pulled out her magnifying glass, a tool she kept handy for her design work, and meticulously examined each glyph. "Look at the precision here, Mia. This isn't just random doodling. Every line, every curve is intentional. It's almost like a tiny alphabet in itself." Amelia nodded, a surge of relief washing over her that Sarah was taking it seriously. "I spent all last night trying to make sense of it. I got nowhere. I thought maybe with your eye for design, for patterns." Sarah hummed, her brow furrowed in concentration. She pulled out her phone, snapping high-resolution photos of the letter, zooming in on each symbol. "Okay, let's see. It's not a standard substitution cipher from what I can tell. No obvious common letter frequencies. And it's not a simple pictograph because some of them repeat, but in different contexts." She paused, tapping her chin. "But there's something familiar about the style of these. Like I've seen something similar somewhere historical, maybe? Or in a very niche art book." Amelia's heart gave a hopeful leap. "Really? Where?" Sarah shook her head, frustrated. "I can't place it. It's just a faint echo. Like when you know a word but can't quite retrieve it. But I'm going to dig. This is too fascinating to ignore. She looked up, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the chase. Your grandmother, huh? The quiet librarian type. Always baking cookies? Who knew she had a secret life as a master cryptographer? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Amelia said, a knot tightening in her stomach. She never mentioned anything like this. Ever. Sarah spent the next few hours poring over the letter, cross-referencing symbols against various historical ciphers, and even ancient scripts she found in her vast digital archives. She tried different approaches, even attempting to find a common key word from the surrounding text, but the symbols remained stubbornly silent. Then, late in the afternoon, as the shadows lengthened in Sarah's apartment, she let out a sudden gasp. Amelia, look at this. She had pulled up an obscure online archive, a digital collection of local historical documents. On the screen was a grainy sepia-toned photograph of a man with a wild shock of white hair and intense, almost haunted eyes. Below the photo was a brief, almost dismissive caption. Arthur Finch, local recluse and amateur cryptographer, vanished without a trace in 1978. Known for his peculiar correspondences. Amelia leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. Arthur Finch? Who is he? Exactly, Sarah said, her voice hushed. Very little is known about him. He was a local legend, apparently. Lived in an old, isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Spent his days studying ancient languages and codes. People called him the Cipher Man. His disappearance was a minor local sensation for a while, then just faded into folklore. But look here. Sarah scrolled down, revealing an old newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile, detailing Finch's disappearance. But it was the small, almost unnoticeable detail in the corner of the clipping that made Amelia's blood run cold. A blurry, hand-drawn illustration, accompanying a brief paragraph about Finch's peculiar notes. And in that illustration, barely visible, were two symbols. An eye with a single tear, and a broken compass rose, identical to the ones on Eleanor's letter. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Eleanor's letter, Arthur Finch, the vanished cryptographer, and these identical unsettling symbols. Couldn't be a coincidence. Sarah, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. My grandmother, she knew him, or she knew of him, and these symbols, they're a link. A direct link to this vanished man and his peculiar correspondences. Sarah looked at her, her face pale. This changes everything, Mia. This isn't just a puzzle from your grandmother. This is a connection to an unsolved disappearance. And if these symbols are from Arthur Finch, a man known for his elaborate codes, then this letter isn't just a message. It's an invitation. An invitation to finish what he started, or perhaps to uncover what he knew. A cold, creeping dread began to settle in Amelia's stomach. The mystery had just deepened, twisting into something far more intricate and potentially dangerous than she had initially imagined. It wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about Arthur Finch, and whatever dark secret had led to his vanishing act decades ago. And now, thanks to her grandmother's coded message, Amelia found herself inextricably linked to it. The thread she had started pulling was longer, darker, and more entangled than she could have ever conceived. And she had a terrifying feeling that the true meaning of those symbols, and the story of Arthur Finch, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The chilling intuition that had settled deep within Emily's bones solidified into a terrifying certainty. The symbols weren't random scribbles, the frantic etchings of a man losing his mind. No, as her eyes scanned the meticulously drawn patterns across Arthur Finch's worn journal pages, a cold intelligence in their arrangement began to emerge, a silent, mocking challenge. This wasn't chaos, it was an intricate, deliberate language, a secret kept in plain sight. She hunched closer, the desk lamp casting long shadows that danced with the flickering anxiety in her chest. Emily had always possessed a peculiar affinity for patterns, a childhood fascination that had once led her down countless rabbit holes of puzzles and riddles. Now that dormant instinct screamed for attention. She noticed a subtle repetition, not of individual symbols, but of specific sequences of symbols, almost like recurring glyphs within a larger, more complex tapestry. These sequences often appeared in the margins, separate from the more densely packed blocks of symbols, as if they were commentary or perhaps a key. Her fingers, trembling slightly, traced the faint indentations on the paper. The journal itself was old, its leather binding cracked, its pages yellowed with age. As she ran her thumb along the spine, a faint, almost imperceptible looseness near the back cover caught her attention. It was too subtle to be a defect of age. It felt intentional. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully, painstakingly, worked her fingernail into the narrow gap. With a soft click that echoed unervingly loud in the silent room, a tiny, thin flap of aged parchment detached from the inside of the back cover, revealing a hidden cavity. Tucked within, folded multiple times until it was no larger than a postage stamp, was another piece of paper. This one was even older, brittle to the touch, and inscribed with a careful hand. It wasn't a full cipher key, not yet, but it was a Rosetta Stone, a partial dictionary of Arthur Finch's desperate language. On one side, a handful of the peculiar symbols from the journal were meticulously drawn, and beside each, a corresponding letter of the English alphabet. On the other side, a series of numbers was matched to a different set of symbols. It was rudimentary, incomplete, but it was there. The first thread of the code. Emily's breath hitched. This was it. This was the key. Her mind raced, the adrenaline sharpening her focus. She carefully unfolded the tiny parchment, laying it flat beside the open journal. Her eyes darted between the partial key and the repeating sequences in the margins. She started with the most frequently recurring sequence, the one that seemed to act as a separator or an emphasis. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to match the symbols on the parchment to the symbols in the journal. It was like trying to piece together a shattered mirror, each fragment revealing only a sliver of the whole. The first word to emerge was fragmented, almost nonsensical. Sid, Ian. Then, after a cluster of undeciphered symbols, another partial word. Sid. Emily frowned. Obsidian pact? The words conjured images of ancient rituals, secret societies, something dark and formidable. Her fingers flew, cross-referencing, her concentration absolute. She felt a surge of triumph, quickly followed by a cold dread, as more words began to coalesce from the jumble of symbols. Silent. Watchers. And then a date, stark and specific. June 14th, 1982. June 14th, 1982. The date hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily immediately pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She typed June 14th, 1982 Unsolved Mysteries United States into the search bar. The results were a dizzying array of local news archives, old forum posts, and Wikipedia entries. Nothing immediately jumped out as significant. No major national headlines, no famous cold cases associated with that specific date. She refined her search, adding Obsidian Pact and Silent Watchers to the query. But those terms yielded nothing but obscure fantasy fiction and gaming references. This wasn't a public event then. This was something hidden, something known only to a select few. And Arthur Finch, it seemed, was one of those few. The partial decryption revealed enough to confirm her terrifying suspicion. Finch hadn't just stumbled upon something. He had been actively investigating it. This Obsidian Pact was real, and he had been trying to expose it, or at least document its existence, through this elaborate personal cipher. The symbols weren't just a coded message. They were a chronicle, a warning. As she delved deeper into the journal, applying the fragments of the key she possessed, the cryptic phrases became more disturbing. On one page, a series of symbols translated to, "They hunt the truth-tellers." On another, "The shadow lengthens, the harvest comes." These weren't the ramblings of a paranoid recluse. They were the desperate dispatches of a man in danger, a man who saw something terrible unfolding and tried to leave a record of it. Emily's eyes scanned the remaining pages of the journal, now seeing the symbols not as abstract art, but as a language of fear and urgency. The sheer volume of coded text was overwhelming. This partial key was merely an appetizer. The full story, the true meaning, was buried deep within these pages, protected by a labyrinthine cipher. She needed more. More keys, more context, more understanding of Finch himself. A sudden sharp rap against the window pane behind her made Emily jump, a gasp catching in her throat. Her head whipped around, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was just a branch swaying in the night breeze, tapping against the glass. But the sudden sound, in the oppressive silence of the house, felt like a direct assault, a violation of her solitude. Her breath hitched. She hadn't felt truly alone in this house since she started this. That sense of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, returned with an unsettling intensity. Was it just her imagination, fueled by the encroaching darkness of the mystery? Or was someone out there beyond the glass, beyond the carefully constructed walls of Finch's secrets? She pushed the thought aside, forcing herself to refocus. Paranoia wouldn't help her now. Logic would. She needed to understand Finch. Who was he really beyond the reclusive librarian? Why would he be entangled with something as sinister as an obsidian pact? She flipped back to the very first page of the journal, hoping for an introduction, a name, anything. There was nothing. Just the elegant, unsettling flourish of the first symbol. But then her gaze fell upon a small faded inscription on the inside cover, barely visible beneath years of dust and grime. It wasn't coded. It was written in plain English in Finch's distinctive, precise hand. To decipher the whispers, one must first find the source. The architect of silence built his empire on forgotten foundations. Seek the old mill, where the river runs red with time. The old mill, Emily murmured, her voice barely a whisper. A physical location. A new lead. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. Architect of silence. This phrase, coupled with Obsidian Pact and Silent Watchers, painted a chilling picture of a powerful, clandestine organization, possibly with a single central figure orchestrating its operations. And Finch, it seemed, was trying to expose this architect. She turned back to the partially decoded message on the marginalia, her fingers flying over the symbols once more, rechecking her work, her eyes scanning for any overlooked detail. And there it was, a phrase she had initially dismissed as fragmented nonsense, now chillingly clear in the context of the new clues. The final sequence of symbols she had managed to partially translate now revealed a complete, horrifying sentence. The architect of the Obsidian Pact's silence is broken. The truth hides in plain sight, within the whispers of the past. Beware the June 14th reckoning. The words hung in the air, a cold, undeniable declaration. The June 14th reckoning. It wasn't a past event Emily had failed to find. It was a future threat, or perhaps a recurring cycle. The architect was still active. The Obsidian Pact was still operating. And Arthur Finch, in his final desperate act, had left behind a warning, a desperate plea for someone, for her to understand. The thread she had started pulling was indeed longer, darker, and more entangled than she could have ever conceived. And she had a terrifying feeling that the true meaning of those symbols, and the story of Arthur Finch, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The chilling realization settled over Emily like a sudden, arctic fog, wrapping around her thoughts and tightening its grip. The symbols weren't just a puzzle. They were a key, a lock, and a hidden door all at once. The thread she had started pulling was indeed longer, darker, and more entangled than she could have ever conceived. And she had a terrifying feeling that the true meaning of those symbols, and the story of Arthur Finch, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The digital glow of her laptop screen reflected in her wide eyes, but she wasn't seeing the static images of the symbols anymore. She was seeing the vast, unknowable depth of the mystery they represented. Sleep was a distant, irrelevant concept. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet productivity, now felt like a command center for a rapidly escalating investigation. She pushed her half-empty coffee mug aside, the cold brew a forgotten casualty in her focused intensity. She pulled up the deciphered letters again, zooming in on the unique character sequences that had plagued her for weeks. She tried everything: frequency analysis, simple substitution, even a few obscure historical ciphers she'd vaguely recalled from an old university course. Nothing. The symbols remained stubbornly opaque, mocking her efforts with their elegant, alien curves. It was clear now, this wasn't a standard code. It was something bespoke, deeply personal, or perhaps ancient. The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Finch. The symbols must be tied to him, to his life, his work, his passions. Why else would they appear so prominently in the letters connected to his death? Her initial research into Finch had been cursory, focused on his immediate circumstances. Now she needed to dig deeper, to excavate the man himself, searching for any clue that might illuminate the dark corners of her current predicament. She started with public records, then moved to academic databases, old newspaper archives, and even obscure genealogy sites. Finch, she knew, had been a quiet, unassuming man, a retired librarian who, by all accounts, had lived a life of quiet routine. But as Emily delved deeper, a different picture began to emerge. Hidden beneath the surface of his mundane existence, Arthur Finch had possessed a profound, almost obsessive interest in a highly specialized and incredibly niche field, forgotten American cryptography. Not the famous codes of wartime, but the esoteric, often hand-drawn ciphers found in the margins of colonial diaries, the coded messages exchanged between obscure secret societies of the 19th century, or the complex pictographic systems sometimes used by isolated communities in the vast American wilderness. He wasn't just a casual enthusiast. He was, by several academic standards, a leading, albeit quiet, expert. Emily found an archived article from a regional historical society journal, dating back nearly 20 years. It detailed Finch's groundbreaking work on a series of previously undeciphered symbols found in the personal correspondence of a lesser-known abolitionist figure. The article praised his meticulous research and his uncanny ability to discern patterns where others saw only random squiggles. This was it. This was the missing link. Arthur Finch didn't just stumble upon codes, he lived and breathed them. But the symbols she had found were unlike anything described in Finch's published work. They didn't resemble any known historical American cipher she could find references to, even in the most obscure corners of his research. This suggested two possibilities. Either Finch had created a new, entirely unique system, or he had encountered a set of symbols so rare, so ancient, that they predated or existed outside of conventional historical records. The latter thought sent a shiver down her spine. As she continued her digital archaeology, she stumbled upon a forum post from a decade ago, on a long-defunct message board dedicated to historical ciphers. The post was brief, an almost frantic query from a user identifying himself only as AF. It asked if anyone recognized a series of symbols he had encountered, which he described as primitive, yet impossibly complex, and unlike anything he had ever seen in his extensive studies. The symbols he described, though not explicitly drawn, bore a striking resemblance to the characteristics of the ones Emily was now scrutinizing. The replies to A.F.'s posts were dismissive, even condescending. Most users suggested he was either mistaken or had simply encountered a child's doodle. One particularly scathing reply from a user named Cipher accused AF of fabricating the symbols for attention, or worse, of being an amateur dabbler wasting the time of serious researchers. Cipher even even at AF having a history of making unsubstantiated claims in the past. Emily felt a surge of indignation on Finch's behalf, but more importantly, she felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't just a random online interaction. This was a glimpse into Finch's world, a world where he was actively searching for answers about these very symbols. What had he found that led to such a frantic query? And who was Cipher She spent hours trying to trace Cipher but the trail went cold. The message board was gone, swallowed by the internet's relentless march. It was a dead end for now, but the exchange lingered in her mind. Had Finch truly found something so unusual that it baffled even his peers? Or was Cipher deliberately trying to discredit him? Her research led her to a small, independent online publication, a digital newsletter for highly specialized cryptology enthusiasts. There, she found a mention of Arthur Finch, dated roughly 2 years before his death. It was an announcement of his retirement from the local library, and a brief paragraph celebrating his contributions to the field of historical American cryptography. But there was a curious addendum, a single sentence that made Emily pause. Mr. Finch is said to be dedicating his retirement to a long-cherished personal project, a deciphering endeavor he has kept closely guarded, hinting only at its potential to rewrite certain chapters of forgotten American history. Rewrite certain chapters of forgotten American history. The words echoed in her mind. This wasn't a hobby project. This was something monumental, something that Finch believed had significant historical implications. And it was closely guarded. Why? What was so sensitive about it? Suddenly, the symbols weren't just a cryptic puzzle anymore. They were the potential key to a secret that Arthur Finch had been on the verge of uncovering. A secret so profound it could rewrite history. And if it was closely guarded, it meant it was dangerous. Dangerous enough, perhaps, to get him killed. A new terrifying hypothesis began to form in Emily's mind. What if Finch hadn't just found these symbols, but had deciphered them? Or at least made significant progress? What if the coded message in the letters wasn't just a challenge, but a desperate attempt by Finch to convey what he had learned? A message hidden in plain sight, disguised as the very type of cryptic communication he specialized in. The implications were staggering. If Finch had indeed uncovered something that powerful, something that someone else might want to keep buried, then his death wasn't a random act of violence. It was an assassination, a calculated silencing, and the symbols, the very things that had drawn Emily into this labyrinth, were the legacy of his struggle, a final desperate cry for help or a warning from beyond the grave. The weight of this possibility pressed down on her, a chilling premonition of danger. She was no longer just solving a puzzle. She was stepping into the shadow of a man who had stumbled upon a truth too volatile to remain hidden. And if that truth was dangerous enough to silence Arthur Finch, what would it mean for the person now trying to bring it to light? Emily pushed back from her desk, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, the sudden noise jarring in the otherwise silent apartment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She needed to look at the symbols again, not as abstract code but as a potential narrative. A story told in an ancient, dangerous language. She pulled up the images, her gaze sweeping over each intricate design, each seemingly random stroke. What if they weren't just letters or words but a sequence? A map? A set of instructions? What if Finch, in his final moments, had tried to leave a breadcrumb trail, knowing what was coming for him? Her eyes fell on a specific cluster of symbols, repeating in a pattern she hadn't noticed before, almost like a signature. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but now, armed with the knowledge of Finch's obsessive nature and his expertise in historical cryptography, it screamed significance. It wasn't just a pattern, it was an embedded clue. And then she saw it. Not in the symbols themselves but in the negative space between them, in the subtle variations in their alignment. A faint, almost imperceptible inconsistency. A tiny deliberate deviation that, to an expert like Finch, would have been a glaring signpost. It was as if someone, perhaps Finch himself, had subtly altered a known code, adding a layer of complexity only he, or someone intimately familiar with his unique approach, could unravel. This wasn't just a message, it was a challenge, a final desperate gamble. And Emily, with her growing understanding of Arthur Finch, was beginning to feel like the only one who might stand a chance of understanding it. But with that understanding came a terrifying sense of exposure. She was no longer a detached observer. She was now part of the story, and the forces that had silenced Arthur Finch might very well be watching her too. The words shimmered on her screen, stark and terrifying in their simplicity. Silas Thorne, Chimera, Key Phoenix. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't a warning. It was an instruction, a directive from beyond the grave, left by a man who had clearly known his time was running out. Arthur Finch wasn't merely a brilliant cryptographer who stumbled upon a dangerous secret. He was an architect of it, or at least deeply enmeshed in whatever Chimera represented. His death, she now knew with chilling certainty, was no accident. It was a silencing. The air in her small apartment suddenly felt heavy, thick with unseen eyes. The blood thrummed in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Emily's gaze darted around the room, every shadow suddenly deeper, every familiar object seeming to hold a sinister secret. The comfortable clutter of her life now felt like a fragile shield, easily shattered. She was no longer an academic, a detached puzzle solver. She was a target. A cold dread snaked its way up her spine. She had been so consumed by the intellectual challenge, by the thrill of the chase, that she had ignored the glaring, obvious truth. Arthur had been murdered. And now she held the key to why. She stood up slowly, her muscles stiff, her eyes scanning every corner of her living space. The window overlooking the street seemed too large, too transparent. The door, usually a symbol of security, now felt flimsy, a mere suggestion of protection. Her heart pounded, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Had someone been here? Was that faint scent of something metallic like old coins just her imagination, or a lingering trace of an intruder? She moved with a newfound, almost predatory caution, her senses on high alert. She checked the locks on her windows, testing each one. Then she walked over to her bookshelf, a towering monolith of first editions and beloved paperbacks. Her gaze landed on a specific volume, a rare first edition of a classic American novel, a gift from her grandfather. She always kept it meticulously placed, its spine perfectly aligned with its neighbors. Now it was pulled out by a fraction of an inch, subtly askew, its spine facing inward, a detail only she, its owner, would ever notice. A gasp escaped her lips, a small strangled sound. It was the kind of detail that could be dismissed as an oversight, a casual bump. But Emily knew better. It was a signature, a message, Asterisk, we were here. We know you're digging. Asterisk. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and furious logic. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't left an obvious calling card. They had simply shown her that her sanctuary was no longer impenetrable. They had planted a seed of doubt, a chilling reminder that she was exposed. Her first instinct was to call Jessica, to pour out the entire terrifying story to her closest friend. Her hand hovered over her phone, but then she pulled back. No, not yet. Jessica was a journalist, sharp and resourceful, but also impulsive. Drawing her into this now would only put her in danger. And what if the thought was a venomous whisper in her mind? What if the forces behind Arthur's death were so pervasive, so powerful, that even the authorities couldn't be trusted? The thought was a chilling prospect, but one she couldn't dismiss. She was alone in this. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Emily forced herself to focus. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had a name, a project, and a key. Silas Thorne. Chimera. Key Phoenix. These were her new anchors in a sea of terror. She retreated to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, driven by a desperate need for answers. Silas Thorne. The search results were sparse, almost eerily so. An old blurry profile picture from a defunct academic journal. A few mentions in obscure scientific forums, always followed by threads that abruptly ended or were deleted. He was described as a brilliant but controversial bioengineer, known for his radical theories on genetic modification and cellular regeneration. Then came Project Chimera. This was where the real chilling details began to surface. Whispers of a highly secretive, privately funded research initiative from over a decade ago. It had been shrouded in controversy, attracting both immense scientific interest and fierce ethical condemnation. The project had supposedly been shut down after only a few years, amidst allegations of human rights violations, unexplained disappearances of research subjects, and a complete lack of transparency. The few news articles that remained were heavily redacted, full of vague legal jargon and official denials. It was as if the internet itself had tried to erase its existence. Emily felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just some abstract cryptographic puzzle anymore. This was about human lives, about dark science, and about a conspiracy so deep that it had been actively scrubbed from public memory. She went back to Arthur's notes, to his meticulously indexed articles and his rambling, often philosophical musings. She looked for Chimera, for Silas Thorne, for Phoenix. Nothing explicit, but then a subtle pattern emerged. Early in his career, before he became known for his groundbreaking work in secure communications, Arthur had published a series of theoretical papers under the pseudonym A. Finch. These papers, largely dismissed by the mainstream scientific community at the time, explored advanced concepts in genetic algorithms and complex biological systems, theoretical frameworks that, in retrospect, seemed to lay the very groundwork for something like Project Chimera. He hadn't just been deciphering someone else's code, he had been contributing to the very theoretical underpinnings of it, perhaps unknowingly at first. A wave of nausea washed over her. Arthur hadn't been a victim who accidentally stumbled into danger. He had been a participant, perhaps even a co-creator, and then a whistleblower trying to expose the very monster he had helped awaken. His Zodiac letters weren't a stylistic homage. They were a desperate, encrypted plea for help, a trail of breadcrumbs meant for someone who could follow them. Someone like her. And then Phoenix. The word echoed in her mind, a beacon in the darkness. She remembered Arthur's apartment, the one she had searched initially, so confident that the answers lay in his digital life. She remembered a small, intricately carved wooden box on his desk, an antique, perhaps from Southeast Asia. It had been locked, and Arthur had always dismissed it as a sentimental trinket, a gift from an old friend, never revealing its contents. At the time, she hadn't given it a second thought. Now the word Phoenix ignited a spark of hope. Was it the key? A literal key or a metaphorical one, a password, a clue to its hidden mechanism? As she sat there, piecing together the terrifying puzzle, her phone chimed. An email. Anonymous sender. No subject line. Her heart leaped into her throat. With trembling fingers, she clicked it open. It was a single image, blurry, grainy, taken from a distance. But there was no mistaking the subject. It was a photo of her own apartment window, taken from the street below, framed by the branches of the ancient oak tree outside. Her silhouette was visible, a faint, ghostly outline against the lamplight within, hunched over her computer. No message. None was needed. The message was chillingly, unequivocally clear. Asterisk, we know. We are watching. You are next. Asterisk. The fear that had been a dull throb now exploded into a searing inferno. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. They weren't just watching, they were taunting her. They wanted her to know that her actions had consequences. But amidst the terror, a strange, fierce resolve began to harden within her. Arthur Finch had been silenced, but he had left her a legacy, a final message, a desperate plea for justice. She had followed his trail, deciphered his code, and now she knew too much to turn back. Running was no longer an option. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. She looked at the chilling photo on her screen, then back at the deciphered words. Silas Thorne. Chimera. Phoenix. A plan dangerous and reckless began to form in her mind. She would find Silas Thorne. She would uncover the truth behind Project Chimera. And she would start by revisiting Arthur's apartment, driven by the desperate hope that the antique wooden box held the next piece of the puzzle, and that the word Phoenix was her way in. She was no longer just solving a mystery. She was fighting for her life, and for Arthur's memory. Emily burst through the heavy oak door of Arthur's apartment building, the familiar scent of old wood and dust doing little to calm her racing heart. Her breath hitched with each step up the 3 flights of stairs, her mind replaying Detective Miller's words, the chilling finality of them. Arthur was gone, and she was next if she didn't move fast. The key felt cold and heavy in her hand as she fumbled with the lock, the click echoing too loudly in the otherwise silent hallway. Stepping inside, the apartment felt like a tomb. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon sun piercing through the drawn blinds. There was an unsettling stillness, a vacuum where Arthur's vibrant presence used to be. Every object, every book on the overflowing shelves, seemed to hum with his memory, a painful reminder of what she had lost and what she was fighting for. She started her search methodically, trying to think like Arthur. He was a man of order, despite the appearance of scholarly chaos. Not a hidden safe behind a painting, not a loose floorboard in the hall. This box, if it truly existed, would be somewhere meaningful to him, yet discreet. She swept through his study first, her eyes darting over stacks of academic papers, ancient texts, and the familiar, comforting scent of pipe tobacco that still clung to the air. Desk drawers yielded only more research notes, pens, and a half-eaten bag of stale pretzels. She checked under his bed, inside his closet, even behind the refrigerator, her desperation mounting with each failed attempt. The word Phoenix circled in her mind, a relentless bird of prey. What did it mean? A book title? A mythological reference? Arthur was fascinated by ancient cultures and symbols. She ran her fingers along the spines of books on mythology, history, folklore. Nothing immediately jumped out. Then she remembered something Arthur had once said, a passing comment about the apartment's original features. He'd been particularly fond of the old fireplace in his study, a beautiful but disused stone hearth that he'd always vowed to restore. He'd called it a phoenix rising from the ashes of forgotten architecture. A jolt went through her. The fireplace. She rushed back into the study, her gaze fixed on the ornate dark stone structure. It was cold, filled with decorative logs Arthur had placed there years ago. She knelt, running her hands over the rough, uneven surface of the bricks. Her fingers brushed against a section near the lower right corner, just above the hearth. It felt slightly different, a subtle give where there should be none. She pressed harder, a faint click sound resonating from within the stone. A small rectangular section of the brickwork, no bigger than her hand, slid inward, revealing a dark recess. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and there it was, nestled within the hidden compartment, perfectly sized for its secret alcove, was an antique wooden box. It was crafted from dark, polished mahogany, intricately carved with swirling patterns and what looked like a stylized bird on the lid, its wings spread wide, a crest of flames rising from its head. A phoenix. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. It was heavier than she expected, cool to the touch. There was no obvious lock or keyhole. She turned it over, examining every angle, her breath held tight in her chest. The phoenix carving on the lid was exquisitely detailed, almost three-dimensional. She pressed it, twisted it, ran her thumb over its smooth surface. Nothing. Then, she noticed a minuscule imperfection, a tiny raised point on the phoenix's left wingtip. She pressed it again, gently, and felt a faint resistance, followed by a soft, almost inaudible snick. The lid, previously seamless, now had a barely perceptible seam. With a shallow breath, she lifted it. The inside was lined with dark velvet, and far from being empty or containing a single item, it was packed with an assortment of peculiar objects. Her eyes darted over them, a mix of confusion and mounting dread swirling within her. First, a thick, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with Arthur's distinctive, precise handwriting. It wasn't a personal diary, but rather a meticulous research log, dated entries stretching back years, even decades. Beneath the journal lay a series of old, brittle maps. They weren't geographical maps of states or cities, but rather specialized charts, some depicting geological formations, others showing historical land grants, and a few that looked like detailed surveys of specific, obscure properties. What caught her attention were the numerous red circles and cryptic symbols Arthur had scrawled on them. Tucked between the maps were a handful of faded photographs. They weren't family pictures. Instead, they depicted crumbling stone structures, overgrown ruins, ancient-looking symbols carved into rock faces, and a few grainy shots of what looked like abandoned industrial complexes. Some of the locations in the photos seemed to correspond with the marked areas on the maps. At the very bottom of the box, resting on the velvet lining, were two more items. One was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, identical in every detail to the phoenix on the box's lid. The other was a strange metallic device, heavy, cold, and unlike anything she had ever seen. It resembled a compass, but without a needle, instead featuring a series of concentric rings, etched with what looked like an ancient alphabet or a complex numerical sequence. Emily carefully lifted the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather. She flipped through it frantically, seeking a starting point, a clue, anything that would make sense of this bizarre collection. The entries were dense, filled with academic jargon, historical references, and increasingly urgent-sounding personal notes. She scanned for recent dates, her eyes finally landing on an entry just 3 days before Arthur's death. "The pattern is undeniable now," Arthur had written, his usually neat hand showing a tremor of urgency. "The Zodiac letters, the unsolved disappearances, the accidents, they are all threads in a much larger tapestry, a network operating in the shadows for generations. Not a single killer, but an organization. I've codenamed them the Syndicate. They manipulate events, control narratives, influence decisions at the highest levels. Their reach is terrifying." Emily's blood ran cold. The Syndicate. This was far bigger than she had ever imagined. Arthur hadn't just been tracking a serial killer. He had stumbled into something far more sinister, far more powerful, and it had cost him his life. She continued to read, her eyes blurring with the frantic pace. Arthur detailed his growing certainty that the Zodiac letters were a deliberate misdirection, a public spectacle designed to draw attention away from the Syndicate's true operations. He believed the letters contained a hidden layer of communication, a cipher used by the Syndicate itself, perhaps to mark their territory, to boast, or even to issue internal commands. "I've found a connection," another entry read, dated 2 days before his death. A specific symbol, repeated in the Zodiac ciphers, also appears in the old land deeds for the Phoenix Project sites. These aren't just abandoned buildings, they're strategic locations. Vaults, archives, perhaps even operational hubs. I believe the metallic device, the ether compass as I've come to call it, is the key to unlocking their true purpose, to locating their central legacy archive. Emily looked at the strange metallic object in the box, then back at the journal. The ether compass. It was a key, a tool. But for what? Arthur's last entry, written just hours before his accident, was chillingly stark. "They know I'm close. I feel their eyes on me. I've arranged a meeting, a desperate gamble to share what I know. If anything happens to me, Emily, you must find this box. The Phoenix is the way in. The ether compass, combined with the journal's coordinates, will lead you to the legacy archive. It holds everything. Don't stop. Expose them. For both of us. For the truth." The words blurred before Emily's eyes. Arthur knew he was going to die. He had left her a breadcrumb trail, a final desperate plea. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a torch passed, a deadly inheritance. The weight of the journal in her hands felt immense, the responsibility crushing. She was no longer just solving a puzzle. She was holding the key to a vast, hidden conspiracy that had already claimed Arthur's life. She looked at the maps, the photos, the ether compass, the legacy archive. That was her next destination. It was the heart of Arthur's research, the ultimate prize, and undoubtedly, the most dangerous place she could possibly go. But there was no turning back. Arthur's last message, his legacy, now rested entirely with her. She had to find it, and she had to expose them before the syndicate silenced her too. The old pickup truck, a borrowed relic from her neighbor, groaned its way down the winding dirt road, kicking up a plume of dust that lingered in the still, late afternoon air. Emily gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the disappearing horizon. The sun, a blood-orange orb, began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desolate landscape. Every mile that separated her from civilization felt like another layer of isolation, another step deeper into the unknown. Arthur's cabin wasn't just remote. It was a fortress against the world, a place he'd chosen for its solitude, for its ability to hide secrets. And now those secrets were hers to uncover. Her mind raced, replaying Arthur's final, frantic call. The fear in his voice, the urgency, the cryptic warnings about the syndicate, and the truth hidden in plain sight. He'd said the key was in his cabin, embedded in his work, disguised within his obsessions. Arthur, a brilliant but eccentric cryptographer, had spent his life deciphering the world's most complex codes, often dabbling in the unsolved mysteries of history. He'd been particularly fascinated by the Zodiac ciphers, not to solve them himself, but to study the mindset of the creator, the patterns, the layers of misdirection. He believed true genius lay not in the complexity of a code, but in its ability to be both obvious and invisible simultaneously. As the truck finally rounded a bend, the cabin emerged from the dense pine forest, a rustic silhouette against the twilight sky. It was exactly as she remembered. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a porch swing that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. No lights were on, no smoke from the chimney. It was utterly, perfectly silent. Too silent. Emily cut the engine, plunging the world into an even deeper hush. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the frantic thump of her own heart. She sat for a long moment, scanning the perimeter, searching for any sign that someone else had been there, or was still there. A broken branch, a fresh tire track, a disturbed patch of moss. Nothing. The cabin seemed to slumber peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing around it. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight and the small backpack she'd packed with essentials. A lockpicking set she'd bought online and practiced with endlessly, a utility knife, a first aid kit, and a satellite phone, a desperate last resort. She knew better than to rely on cell service out here. As her boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the porch, every nerve ending screamed at her. This wasn't just a search, it was an intrusion, a desecration of Arthur's sanctuary, but one he had implicitly asked her to make. The front door, old and heavy, was locked with a sturdy deadbolt. Emily produced her pick set, her hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Arthur had taught her the basics years ago, a morbid fascination of his, always insisting that knowledge of locks is knowledge of secrets. Within minutes, with a soft click, the bolt retracted. She pushed the door open slowly, a sliver of darkness widening into a gaping maw. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper, dust, and Arthur's pipe tobacco. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing across stacks of books, overflowing bookshelves, and a desk buried under notes, magnifying glasses, and half-eaten mugs of dried coffee. It was Arthur's world, frozen in time. The very chaos of it was a system, one only he truly understood. "Okay, Arthur," she whispered into the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Where did you hide it?" She started in his study, the heart of his intellectual life. She knew he wouldn't make it easy. Arthur reveled in complexity, in the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. He wouldn't just leave a USB stick under his pillow. He would embed it, disguise it, make it another one of his elaborate ciphers. She ran her hands along the spines of books, feeling for loose covers, hollowed out pages. She tapped walls, listened for subtle differences in sound, searching for hidden compartments. She checked under the desk, behind paintings, inside the grandfather clock. Nothing but dust and the echoes of her own breathing. Then, her eyes landed on a specific section of his bookshelf. Not the rare first editions or the ancient texts, but a collection of books on cryptography and historical ciphers. Among them, a worn leather-bound volume titled Unraveling the Zodiac, a study in cryptic communication. This was it. This had to be it. She pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, and as she flipped through the pages she realized why. Many of the original pages had been meticulously hollowed out, creating a rectangular cavity within. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the cavity was empty. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He wouldn't have left it empty. Not Arthur. He was too clever, too precise. She examined the hollowed-out book more closely. The edges of the cutout were perfect, almost machine-made. And then she saw it. Along the inner spine of the hollowed section, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, were a series of tiny, almost microscopic pinpricks. They weren't random. They formed a pattern. A grid. A cipher grid. Emily pulled a small notebook and pen from her backpack. Arthur had always insisted on analog methods for initial decryption. She carefully copied the pinprick pattern, a grid of dots and dashes, onto an empty page. It looked like a variation of a Grill's cipher, where a template is placed over a text to reveal a message. But what was the text? And where was the grill? She looked around the study again, her gaze now sharper, more focused. Arthur loved to layer his puzzles. The hollowed book was a clue, not the solution itself. She remembered his lectures on the Zodiac Killer's methods, how the killer often used symbols and numbers, sometimes incorporating elements of the very letter itself into the cipher. Her eyes drifted to Arthur's main desk, specifically to a large, framed map of Northern California pinned to the corkboard above it. It was speckled with red thumbtacks, marking various points of interest, historical sites, old battlefields, all places Arthur had researched for his various projects. But one cluster of thumbtacks, near Lake Berryessa, seemed particularly dense. And within that cluster, a specific, almost imperceptible pattern emerged if you squinted just right. The thumbtacks, when connected, formed a crude, irregular shape. It wasn't a letter or a number. It was a key, a template. She grabbed a piece of tracing paper from his desk and carefully traced the outline formed by the specific thumbtacks. Then she took it back to the Unraveling the Zodiac book. She held the tracing paper over the pinprick grid she'd copied. It didn't fit. Not perfectly. The shape was wrong, the scale off. Frustration bubbled up. She was missing something. She paced the small study, her mind racing. What was the connection between the book, the pinpricks, and the map? Arthur's fascination with Zodiac. The Zodiac Killer ciphers often incorporated symbols, sometimes even the very structure of the letter itself. Then it hit her. The book wasn't just a container. It was part of the cipher. Unraveling the Zodiac. A study in cryptic communication. The title itself could be a key. Or the pages. She went back to the hollowed-out book. She noticed the page numbers on the remaining, uncut pages. They were sequential, of course, but what if the sequence was important? What if the pinpricks weren't meant to be read on a blank grid, but on specific pages of another book? She scanned the bookshelf again, looking for a companion volume, something related to the Zodiac. There were several. One stood out. A slender, unmarked journal bound in plain brown leather, tucked between two thick tomes on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It looked out of place, almost deliberately hidden. She pulled it out. It was a personal journal, filled with Arthur's cramped, precise handwriting. Not daily entries, but instead, a series of notes, observations, and theoretical cipher constructions. She flipped through it, her eyes catching phrases like Zodiac's genius in misdirection, the power of the null cipher, and the hidden message within the message. This was it. This was his working mind. And then near the back, she found a series of blank pages, each meticulously numbered. And on some of these pages, faint, almost invisible pencil marks. She held the hollowed-out, Unraveling the Zodiac book over these blank pages in the journal. And there it was. A perfect alignment. The pinpricks from the hollowed book now aligned with the faint pencil marks on the journal pages. She held her breath, heart pounding. This was the grill. The template. She carefully moved the hollowed book, page by page, over the journal, aligning the pinprick grill with the faint pencil marks. As she did, individual letters, seemingly random, peeked through the holes. She began to transcribe them one by one into her notebook. Hin or Y. Then N-I-N. And then S-V-N-T-Y-F-I-V. January 11th, 1975. A date. But what did it mean? Was it a date of an event? A deadline? A birth date? It didn't seem to immediately form a coherent message. She continued, painstakingly aligning the grill, transcribing the letters. The next set of revealed letters spelled out LCKBOX. Then Besimienti. January 11, 1975. Lockbox. Basement. A thrill shot through her, quickly followed by a chill. This was it. This was the instruction. The date was likely a key, a combination, or a reference point. The lockbox in the basement. Arthur's basement was notorious for being a labyrinth of forgotten experiments and dusty archives. But just as she was about to close the journal and head for the basement door, a faint flicker of light caught her eye through the window. It was distant, barely perceptible, but it was there. A single brief flash, like a camera flash, or a reflection off something metallic. It came from the direction of the tree line, about a quarter-mile away. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The syndicate. They knew. They had known all along. She extinguished her flashlight, plunging the study into near-total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. She pressed herself against the wall next to the window, peering out into the inky blackness. Nothing. The light was gone. Had she imagined it? A trick of the light? Or a warning? Her heart hammered, a frantic drum against her ribs. She couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. Arthur's legacy, the truth he died trying to expose, was within reach. She had to get to that basement. She had to find that lockbox. But now every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the old cabin a potential intruder. She was no longer just a seeker of truth. She was prey. And the hunter was closing in. The silence of the cabin now felt less like peace and more like the bated breath of a predator. She knew with chilling certainty that her time was running out. She knew with chilling certainty that her time was running out. A cold dread seized Emily, tightening its grip around her chest. But it was quickly eclipsed by a surge of primal adrenaline. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind, usually a meticulous labyrinth of logic, now raced with raw survival instincts. She scanned the cabin's interior, every shadow suddenly a potential threat, every creak of the old wood a harbinger of danger. The flickering lantern cast dancing specters on the walls, transforming familiar objects into grotesque shapes. Her gaze landed on the heavy oak door, then the windows, each one feeling like a gaping maw inviting disaster. She mentally cataloged her options, meager as they were. No phone signal, miles from civilization. Her only weapons were her wits and whatever she could improvise. She snatched up a heavy cast-iron skillet from the small kitchen counter, its weight a surprising comfort in her trembling hand. It wasn't much, but it was something. She moved with a newfound stealth, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. First, she checked the front door, testing the deadbolt, then dragging a heavy antique chest in front of it, a futile barricade against a determined assailant, but a psychological one for her. Next, the windows. She pulled the thick curtains shut, plunging the cabin into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of her laptop screen and the single lantern. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Then she heard it, a faint snap from outside. It was too deliberate to be an animal, too close to be the wind. Someone was out there. Someone was watching. Her breath hitched. She froze, skillet raised, straining her ears. The cabin's silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Was it her imagination fueled by fear? Or was the hunter playing a cruel game? She crept to the nearest window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtains. The moon, a sliver of silver, offered little illumination. Shadows stretched long and distorted under the pines. Nothing. Just the whispering trees and the vast, indifferent darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling. The air itself felt charged, heavy with unseen presence. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. What did they want? The letters. The cipher. They knew she was close. She had to finish it. She had to understand what she had stumbled upon, not just for her own survival, but for the truth. Returning to the table, her fingers flew across the keyboard, her focus narrowing to the complex patterns on the screen. The pressure was immense, but it also sharpened her senses, pushing her past the wall of fear. She remembered a faint, almost imperceptible inconsistency she dismissed earlier, a subtle shift in symbol frequency in one of the later letters. It had bothered her, a nagging loose end. Now, under the shadow of imminent danger, it screamed for attention. She isolated the segment, applying a layered substitution algorithm she'd been experimenting with. The symbols rearranged, shifted, and for a fleeting moment still made no sense. But then, a flicker of an idea. What if it wasn't a single cipher but a key to a different, much older one? A key hidden within the text itself. She remembered an obscure historical reference she'd once read about a secret society in the late 19th century that used a living cipher, where certain elements of the message itself dictated the decoding method. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. She started cross-referencing specific words from the decoded segments with the pattern of symbols in the uncoded parts of the same letters. Her breath hitched. A pattern emerged. Not just a pattern, but a rule. The third letter of every seventh word in the plaintext, when converted to a numerical value based on its position in the alphabet, determined the shift for the next block of symbols. It was ingenious and terrifying. Her fingers trembled as she applied the complex logic. The screen filled with a torrent of new text, replacing the gibberish. It was fragmented at first, a jumble of words, but then slowly, horrifyingly, it began to coalesce into coherent sentences. The first full sentence that materialized sent a jolt of ice through her veins. The legacy must be preserved. The harvest will commence on the solstice. Emily stared, her blood running cold. The legacy. The harvest. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was current. This was active. She scrolled down, her eyes devouring the unfolding message. Our eyes are everywhere. The children of the serpent will guide the new age. The unbelievers shall be purified. The architect's vision will be realized. Prepare the vessels. The great work draws near. It was a manifesto, a chilling, fanatical declaration of intent. It spoke of a shadowy organization, a cult, dedicated to some grand, sinister vision. And the Zodiac letters, the ones she had been studying, were not just historical relics, but ongoing communications, a coded dialogue between the members of this terrifying group. The original letters she thought were a historical anomaly were merely the earliest documented instances of this communication method. The Zodiac was not a single killer, but a symbol for this group, a mark of their harvest. Suddenly, a loud thump against the back wall of the cabin made her jump, dropping the skillet with a deafening clang. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was no longer a theoretical threat. This was real. They were here. She scrambled away from the table, grabbing the skillet again, her eyes darting frantically around the small space. The sound hadn't come from the door or the windows. It was the back wall near her small bedroom. Was someone trying to get in through the flimsy wooden boards? Another thump, closer this time, followed by a splintering sound. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. They were breaking in. Emily's mind screamed for an escape route. The front door was barricaded, but maybe she could slip out the back through the small utility door in the kitchen, if she could get to it before they breached the bedroom wall. She clutched the skillet, moving towards the kitchen, her gaze fixed on the wall that now seemed to groan under assault. Just as she reached the kitchen doorway, a section of the wall near the bedroom gave way with a sickening crack, revealing a jagged hole. A dark, gloved hand reached through, followed by a powerful shadowed arm. Emily gasped, stumbling back. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst. She saw a glimpse of a dark figure, broad-shouldered, trying to force its way through the narrow opening. There was no time to think. She had to run. She spun around, sprinting for the small utility door at the back of the kitchen, fumbling with the primitive bolt. Her fingers, slick with sweat, struggled to grasp the cold metal. Behind her, she heard the sounds of wood tearing, the grunts of the intruder as they widened the breach. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but the words from the decoded message echoed in her mind. The unbeliever shall be purified. The great work draws near. They weren't just trying to stop her. They were trying to silence her permanently. With a desperate wrench, the bolt slid open. She yanked the door inward and burst out into the frigid night air, not bothering to close it behind her. The cold was a shock, but it was a welcome sensation, a sharp contrast to the suffocating terror of the cabin. She plunged into the dense woods behind the cabin, the uneven ground snagging at her feet. Branches whipped at her face and arms, but she barely registered the pain. Her only thought was to put distance between herself and the cabin. She could hear sounds of pursuit behind her. Crashing through the undergrowth, heavy footsteps. They were fast. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she pushed harder, weaving between trees, trying to use the darkness and the rugged terrain to her advantage. She had to lose them. She had to get to safety. But where? Then, a glint of metal in the moonlight. She ducked instinctively, a sharp whip sound passing perilously close to her ear. A throwing knife. They weren't playing games. This was an execution. She risked a glance back. Two figures cloaked in dark, hooded garments moved through the trees with an unnatural swiftness, their faces obscured by shadow. They weren't just ordinary thugs. They were skilled, relentless hunters. The cult wasn't just a collection of fanatics. It was an organized, deadly force. Emily veered sharply to the left, scrambling down a steep embankment, sliding on loose leaves and pine needles. She landed hard at the bottom, pain shooting up her ankle, but she forced herself up, limping onward. She needed a plan. She needed help. Her mind raced, trying to recall any details about the surrounding area. There was an old, disused logging trail a few miles east. She remembered seeing it on a faded map in the cabin. If she could reach it, she might have a chance. It wouldn't lead to immediate safety, but it was a path, a direction, away from these relentless pursuers. She pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes, tearing her skin, but the pain was a distant echo to the terror fueling her. The decoded message, still fresh in her mind, was a horrifying affirmation of everything she had suspected, and infinitely worse. This wasn't just about a historical cipher. It was about a modern-day threat, a shadowy organization planning something catastrophic. The harvest will commence on the solstice. How much time did she have? The thought spurred her on. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running with a terrible secret, a warning that needed to be heard. She had to expose them. She had to get this information out. She ran until her vision blurred, her lungs screaming for air. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fade, then reappear, an agonizing game of cat and mouse. She risked another glance over her shoulder. The two hooded figures were still there, like dark wraiths gaining on her. They moved with an eerie coordination, their movements fluid and silent. Suddenly, she burst out of the dense woods into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated, abandoned shack, barely more than a lean-to, its roof caved in. It offered no real shelter, but it was something. A place to catch her breath, to think even for a moment. She stumbled inside, collapsing against a rotting wooden beam, gasping for air. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. She could hear the pursuers approaching the clearing, their footsteps now crunching on the fallen leaves. They knew she was here. She looked around frantically. No escape. The single broken window was too small. The door hung precariously on one hinge. She was trapped. But then her eyes landed on something in the corner, half buried under a pile of rubble and old tarps. A faint shimmer. She crawled towards it, ignoring the throbbing in her ankle, and brushed away the debris. It was a metal box, rusted and ancient, but surprisingly intact. And on its lid, etched deeply into the tarnished metal, was a symbol. A circle intersected by a cross. A familiar symbol. The very symbol she had found hidden within the Zodiac letters. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an abandoned shack. This was a waypoint, a meeting place, a cache. And she had just stumbled right into the heart of their territory. The hunter wasn't closing in. She had run straight into the lion's den. The silence of the shack was no longer a reprieve. It was the suffocating stillness before the trap sprung shut. Emily knew with a horrifying certainty that she had made a terrible mistake, and this time there might be no escape. The air in the shack had grown heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and impending dread. Emily's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Her eyes darted around the confined space, searching, analyzing, but seeing only shadows that seemed to lengthen and twist into menacing shapes. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silence was absolute, yet it shrieked with an unseen presence. She wasn't alone. She couldn't be. A faint, almost imperceptible click echoed from the doorway she had just entered. Emily spun around, her gaze fixed on the rusty latch. It was no longer ajar. It was shut, not just closed but locked. A metallic thud, soft but definitive, confirmed it. Her blood ran cold. She tried the handle, twisting it frantically. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. Panic, raw and visceral, clawed at her throat. She pounded on the door, her fists stinging against the unyielding wood, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. No answer. Only the accelerated thumping of her own heart. Then a low hum started, vibrating through the floorboards. It was subtle at first, like a distant generator, but it quickly intensified, filling the shack with a deep, resonant thrum. Emily's eyes widened as she scanned the room again, desperation sharpening her senses. In the far corner, tucked beneath a pile of old tarps, a small dark device began to glow with a faint, pulsing red light. It was a speaker, she realized, and it was active. A voice, distorted and synthesized, filled the shack deep and calm, yet utterly chilling. "Welcome, Emily. Or should I say, the seeker of truth?" Emily gasped, stumbling back until she hit the opposite wall. It was the letter writer, the architect of this elaborate, terrifying game. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want?" The synthetic voice chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "What I want, Emily, is for you to understand, to see the truth that was buried, paved over, and forgotten. You've been doing well. Impressively so. You found the shack. You understood the lion's den was a warning, not an invitation to safety. But you walked in anyway. Curious. What have you done?" She spat, her mind racing, trying to find an angle and escape. "Where's David?" "Your uncle is currently engaged in his own pursuit of truth," the voice replied, a hint of amusement in its tone. "He's at the old clinic, isn't he? Digging around, looking for evidence. A very dangerous pastime, especially when you're digging up graves." Emily's blood ran cold. "David? He was in danger. What have you done to him?" "Nothing yet," the voice purred. "His fate, like yours, depends entirely on how well you play the game. The stakes have just been raised, Emily. Consider this the next level." The red light on the speaker intensified, flickering wildly. Then text began to scroll across a small, integrated screen on the device. It wasn't a cipher this time, but plain English, stark and chilling. Asterisk the clinic. A place of healing. A place of secrets. Asterisk. Beneath the veneer of care, a darker truth resided. Asterisk they took lives. They silenced dissent. They built an empire on lies. Asterisk. And the architect of that empire still walks free. Emily read the words, her mind reeling. The clinic. Dr. Evans. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about the missing people. It was about a systemic cover-up, a network of corruption. The anonymous letters weren't just a cry for help. They were a meticulously crafted exposé. "You said you wanted me to understand," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Tell me everything. Tell me who they are." "Patience, Emily. The truth must be earned, not simply given," the voice responded. "You are locked in here for a reason. This shack holds a final piece of the puzzle, a piece that will expose the true mastermind. But it's not a physical object you seek. It's a memory, a revelation." The screen on the device changed again, displaying a new set of instructions. "Look closely at your surroundings. The shack itself is a message, one from a ghost. Find the signature. Decipher the final lament. Your uncle's time is running out. A ghost. A final lament." Emily's grandfather, Michael. The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. This shack. Could it have been his? Was this where he worked on the cold cases, where he pieced things together before he died? The dust, the old tools, the sense of abandonment. It suddenly felt less like a trap and more like a shrine. She began to search, her fingers brushing against the rough walls, the dusty shelves. Her eyes scanned every inch of the decaying structure. The speaker continued to hum softly in the corner, a constant reminder of her unseen captor and David's peril. She had to find it. She had to. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She found nothing. Just cobwebs, splintered wood, and the stale air of neglect. Despair began to creep in, chilling her to the bone. "There's nothing here," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Tell me what I'm looking for." The voice remained silent for a long moment. Then it spoke, a cold edge entering its tone. "Tick-tock, Emily. Every second you waste is a second David loses. Think like your grandfather. Think like Michael. What did he leave behind? What secret did he keep here?" Michael. Her grandfather. He was obsessed with the Zodiac-style letters, with the cold cases. He had a meticulous mind, a way of seeing patterns where others saw chaos. She remembered his study, filled with notes, maps, and his peculiar system of cross-referencing. He always said, "The answer is never where you expect it, Emily. It's hidden in plain sight." Plain sight. The shack itself. She paused, taking a deep breath, forcing herself to slow down to think. What if the signature wasn't a physical object but a method? A way of communicating that only Michael would use, something she'd observed him doing? She looked at the walls again, not for an object but for a pattern. The wood was old, weathered. Some planks were newer, patched in. Others had faint markings, scratches, discoloration. She ran her hand over a particularly rough plank near the back wall, almost hidden by a sagging shelf. Her fingers brushed against something. Not a scratch but a groove. Then another. And another. They were subtle, almost indistinguishable from the natural wear of the wood. But as she followed them, her heart began to pound with renewed hope. They weren't random. They formed shapes. Crude, almost childlike but distinctly familiar. A series of small geometric symbols. The same symbols she had seen in the margins of her grandfather's old notebooks. His personal shorthand. His signature. "I found it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of awe and terror. "His signature. What now?" The speaker crackled to life. "Excellent, Emily. Now the lament. The final truth he tried to tell. The truth that cost him everything." Emily traced the symbols again, her mind racing through her grandfather's old ciphers, his personal coding system. She remembered a specific notebook, one he kept locked away, filled with what he called his personal reflections on cases. In it, he occasionally used these symbols to denote particularly sensitive information, often followed by a short, encrypted phrase. She squinted, trying to make out the faint, almost erased markings next to the symbols. It wasn't numbers, wasn't letters. It was a sequence of small, almost imperceptible nicks in the wood, each spaced slightly differently. A Morse code variant? A simple substitution based on length? Her mind flashed back to a specific memory. Her grandfather, frustrated with a stubborn lock, had once told her, "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most overlooked." Like a child's game of knock-knock, knock-knock, a sequence of taps. She looked at the nicks again. They weren't just nicks, they were like tiny deliberate dents. One small dent, a pause. Two small dents, a pause. Three small dents. It was a rudimentary tapping code, a binary system of sorts or a simple count. She began to decode it, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against the ancient wood. One nick, two nicks, three nicks. Each sequence represented a letter. She worked quickly, furiously, her breath held tight in her chest. The message slowly revealed itself, not as a complex cipher, but as a series of simple, heartbreaking words.
Asterisco H trattino basso e trattino basso I trattino basso S trattino basso T trattino basso H trattino basso E trattino basso M trattino basso A trattino basso S trattino basso T trattino basso E trattino basso R asterisco.
Emily stared at the decoded message, etched not in ink, but in the very fabric of the shack, a ghost's last gasp. Dr. Evans. He was the mastermind. Not just involved, but the mastermind. Sarah's death was no accident. Her grandfather had known. He had been trying to expose it. A cold dread washed over her, far more terrifying than the locked door. Her grandfather had died shortly after his obsession with these cases peaked. Had he been silenced? Was this shack his final desperate attempt to leave a breadcrumb trail? The synthetic voice returned, cutting through the chilling revelation. "You found it, Emily. The truth Michael died trying to expose. Dr. Arthur Evans. The esteemed pillar of our community, the man who orchestrated a network of medical fraud, illegal experiments, and silenced anyone who threatened his empire. Your grandfather was very close to exposing him. Too close." "He killed my grandfather," Emily whispered, the realization a bitter taste in her mouth. "He arranged for it to look like a heart attack," the voice confirmed, its tone chillingly calm. "A man of his standing has many resources. But Michael, even in death, refused to be silenced. He left a trail. He built this game in a way. He knew someone would follow. He knew you would. Why didn't you just tell me?" Emily screamed, tears welling in her eyes. "Why this game? Why put David and me in danger?" "Because the truth, Emily, must be felt," the voice replied, a strange intensity in its tone. "It must be experienced. It must be fought for. Only then will it truly resonate. Only then will people listen. I am merely guiding you, much like Michael guided me. He tried to recruit me, you see, to help him expose Evans. I was hesitant until his death. Then I understood. The only way to bring down a man like Evans is to play his own game, to expose him so publicly, so undeniably, that even his power cannot save him. Who are you? Emily asked again, her voice raw. Someone who lost everything to Dr. Evans' ambition, the voice said, a flicker of genuine pain in its synthesized delivery. Someone who was close to Sarah, someone who saw what Michael saw, and someone who has now given you the final piece. The name, the motive, the man. Now you must act. Your uncle is still in the clinic, remember? And Evans has eyes everywhere. Suddenly, the hum of the speaker intensified, and a new message flashed across its screen, urgent and terrifying. David is trapped. Evans' men are closing in. Asterisk, the final cipher, hidden within the shack. Asterisk. It reveals the escape route for David, and your own way out. Fail and you both become ghosts. The locked door. The hidden message. The immediate danger to David. This wasn't just a puzzle. It was a race against time. A desperate scramble for survival. Emily looked around the shack, her eyes now searching for more than just symbols, but for a hidden compartment, a secret panel, anything that could contain the final cipher. Her grandfather's ghost had led her this far. Now she had to trust him to lead her out. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, deadly, and personal. And the clock was ticking. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, deadly, and personal. And the clock was ticking. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the terrifying urgency of her situation. Her grandfather's study, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, each shadow a potential hiding place, each book a silent sentinel guarding its cryptic truth. She moved with a desperate energy, her hands sweeping across dusty shelves, pulling open drawers, examining the underside of every surface. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a familiar comfort that now felt suffocating. She started with the obvious, the places a man might hide something important. The false bottom of the antique humidor? Empty. The loose panel behind the grandfather clock? Just cobwebs. She ran her fingers along the ornate carvings of his heavy oak desk, feeling for a hidden spring, a subtle indentation. Nothing. Her mind raced, sifting through years of memories, trying to recall any peculiar habit, any offhand remark her grandfather, Arthur, might have made about secret compartments or hidden messages. He was a man of routines, yes, but also a man who delighted in intellectual games in layers of meaning. Her gaze fell upon the wall of books, Arthur's True Kingdom. Thousands of spines, each a world unto itself. He had always said, "The real message, Chloe, is never where you expect it. It hides in plain sight." Just like the Zodiac's confession. She remembered him specifically referencing one book, a worn first edition copy of the Zodiac Killer, a comprehensive analysis. Not just any copy, but his copy. He'd often tap its cover with a knowing look, saying, "The key, my dear, is always in the details." Always. She'd always assumed he meant the analysis within the book, the scholarly insights into the killer's mind. But what if he meant something far more literal? Her fingers trembled as she located the book, nestled between other true crime tomes and cryptography manuals. It was heavier than it looked, its spine cracked, its pages brittle with age. She pulled it from the shelf, its weight surprising her. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in its balance hinted at something amiss. She ran her thumb along the edge of the pages, feeling a slight unevenness. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just a book. It was a container. With a surge of adrenaline, she carefully peeled back the cover. The first few pages were intact, but then a perfectly hollowed-out rectangle stared back at her, a dark void within the paper block. It wasn't empty. Nestled within was a small, thin, leather-bound portfolio, no bigger than her palm, secured with a tarnished silver clasp. Her hand shook as she pried it open. Inside, tucked beneath a layer of faded silk, was a single sheet of paper. It was aged, brittle, the edges softened by time. On it, meticulously drawn in Arthur's distinctive hand, was a grid of symbols and numbers. This wasn't a page ripped from the original Zodiac letters. This was something different. The symbols were familiar, yet subtly altered. There were angular crosses, circles with dots, inverted verses, and what looked like astrological glyphs, but some had an extra line, a slight curve, a tiny modification that set them apart from the known zodiac alphabet. And beneath the grid, a precise sequence of numbers, seemingly random, yet too deliberate to be accidental. It was a cipher, clearly designed by her grandfather. He hadn't just analyzed the zodiac, he had mimicked its structure, creating his own personal deadly code. A wave of both awe and terror washed over her. This was it. This was the final cipher, the culmination of his obsession, the message he had risked everything to conceal. But how to unlock it? She remembered another of Arthur's quirks, his personal codebook. He joked that every good cryptographer needed their own Rosetta Stone, a private language for private thoughts. It wasn't a published book, but a small hand-stitched notebook he'd always kept close. She'd seen it countless times, but never paid it much mind, assuming it was just his scribbled notes on various ciphers. She scanned the study again, her eyes darting to familiar spots. His desk, his armchair, the small sturdy stool he used to reach the highest shelves. The floorboards. She remembered him complaining once about a loose floorboard near his favorite reading nook, right by the desk. He'd always said, "A good secret needs a good foundation, Chloe." With renewed hope, she moved the heavy armchair, revealing the worn wooden floor beneath. Her fingers traced the lines between the planks until she found it. A slightly raised board, barely noticeable. With a grunt of effort, she pried it up. There it was. Tucked into the shallow cavity, just as he described, lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. This was it. Her grandfather's personal cipher key. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. She settled at the desk, spreading out the aged paper with Arthur's cipher and opening the personal journal. The journal was filled with his meticulous script, symbol-to-letter mappings, numerical sequences, and even a few diagrams of what looked like astrological charts merged with geometric patterns. It took agonizing minutes to find the relevant section, but then her eyes landed on a page titled, Decode Variant Gamma. Underneath, a detailed legend, matching the subtly altered symbols on the cipher sheet to specific letters and numbers. Her fingers traced the symbols on the cipher, then moved to the journal, slowly, painstakingly transcribing. The first few words were disjointed, just fragments, but then a chilling clarity began to emerge. The message was not a solution to the zodiac, but a warning, a desperate, urgent plea from beyond the grave. "He is not gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she deciphered the first line. Each word that followed sent a fresh jolt of ice through her veins. "He watches." The pattern repeats. The zodiac was a mask. The true target. The innocent. "He knows my work. He will come for the key. Protect the legacy." The final piece is in the... Before she could finish reading the last word, before the full horror of her grandfather's revelation could fully sink in, a distinct creak echoed from the floorboards downstairs. A sound utterly out of place, utterly terrifying. Someone else was in the house. Chloe froze, the decoded message clutched in her hand, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Her grandfather's ghost had led her this far, not just to a puzzle, but to a confrontation. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, deadly, and personal, and the clock was ticking. Clutched in her hand, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Her grandfather's ghost had led her this far, not just to a puzzle, but to a confrontation. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, deadly, and personal, and the clock was ticking. Emily's fingers, trembling uncontrollably, tightened around the object. It wasn't a weapon nor a simple note. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a robin so familiar from her grandfather's workshop, yet this one felt heavier, denser than any she remembered. Her thumb traced the smooth, worn wood, feeling for a seam, a subtle imperfection. And then there it was, a barely perceptible line running along the bird's side. With a surge of desperate hope, she twisted the robin's head. A tiny, almost inaudible click echoed in the silent room. The bird split open, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside, rolled tightly, was a slip of aged parchment. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she unfurled it. It wasn't a map or a string of numbers. It was a single word, meticulously handwritten in her grandfather's distinctive script. Marion. Below it, a date. October 26, 1978. Marion. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. Marion Hayes, the woman her grandfather had been accused of having an affair with, the scandal that had nearly ruined his career and their family, the woman who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the accusations, leaving a cloud of suspicion hanging over her grandfather for decades. But what did this mean? Why now? Why this cryptic reveal? A sudden sharp creak from the floorboards behind her shattered the fragile silence. Emily whirled around, the parchment still clutched in her hand. Standing in the doorway, a shadow silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway, was David. Her breath hitched. David, her grandfather's old apprentice, the man who had been so kind, so helpful, so eager to assist her with the letters. His face, usually open and friendly, was now a mask of grim determination. In his hand something glinted dully. "You found it," David said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "I knew you would. Your grandfather was always too clever for his own good." Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through Emily. "David? What is this?" He stepped further into the room, the object in his hand resolving into a heavy, antique letter opener, its silver blade gleaming ominously. "This, Emily, is the end of a very long, very complicated story. A story your grandfather thought he could bury, then tried to resurrect." "Marion," Emily whispered, the name a question more than a statement. David's lip curled into a bitter smile. "Marion Hayes. My mother." The revelation sucker-punched Emily. David, son of Marion Hayes? The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. The connection to her grandfather, the disappearance, the decades of silence. "Your grandfather didn't have an affair with my mother, Emily," David continued, his voice now laced with an icy fury. "He ruined her. And then he killed her." Emily stumbled back, shaking her head. "No. My grandfather, he was a good man. He loved my grandmother. He would never. He was a coward," David roared, taking another step closer. "My mother discovered his little side project, his obsession with cracking the code of the city's underbelly. He was trying to expose a network of dirty cops, corrupt politicians, and even a few prominent businessmen who were using coded messages, disguised as mundane correspondence, to coordinate their illicit activities. My mother was an investigative journalist, brilliant and fearless. She was helping him." He paused, a dark shadow crossing his face. "But then she found something bigger, something that implicated someone very powerful. She was going to go public. Your grandfather, terrified of the repercussions, of what it would do to his family, tried to stop her. They argued. He pushed her. She fell. And she hit her head. He panicked. He buried her body, hid the evidence, and let everyone believe she'd run off with some lover." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "But the letters, the Zodiac style?" "A smoke screen," David explained, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "A brilliant, twisted smokescreen. Your grandfather knew he couldn't just disappear Marion. He needed a distraction. So using the very codes and methods he'd been studying, he crafted those Zodiac-style letters. Not to kill but to create chaos. To send the police on a wild goose chase, far away from Marion's real fate. He even planted a few false clues, hinting at a larger network of killers, to keep the focus away from a simple, tragic accident he compounded into murder. He used the fear of a serial killer to cover up a single death?" Emily whispered, horrified. "He used it to buy himself time to bury the truth and to protect his precious family," David spat. "And he largely succeeded. Until a few months ago. He became ill. He knew he was dying. And the guilt, Emily, it finally broke him. He started leaving breadcrumbs, like a desperate man trying to confess from beyond the grave. The Zodiac letters he'd been sending you weren't threats. They were his final, tortured confession. He was trying to lead you to the truth about Marion, hoping you would finish what he started. Expose the real network he'd been tracking, and in doing so expose his crime." David gestured to the parchment in Emily's hand. "That bird, that name, that date. That's not a clue to the network. That's his admission. Marion, October 26, 1978, the day he killed her. The bird itself, a symbol of freedom, now her prison." Emily's mind reeled. Her grandfather, a murderer? The benevolent old man who had taught her to love puzzles, who had filled her childhood with warmth and laughter. The man whose ghost had been guiding her? It was too much. "And you," Emily said, finding her voice, though it trembled. You knew all along? I suspected, David admitted, a flicker of pain in his eyes. My mother disappeared. My father was heartbroken, destroyed. I was just a boy, but I remember the whispers, the way people looked at your grandfather. I started working for him years later, desperate for any connection to my mother, any clue. I found his old journals, his research into the network, his drafts of those twisted letters. I started piecing it together. The coded messages weren't just about a network, they were about him. His guilt. His confession. So you helped me to get to this point? Emily asked, a chilling realization dawning on her. You wanted me to find the truth, but then? Then you become a liability, David finished, his voice cold again. Your grandfather wanted redemption. I want justice. Justice for my mother. And that means no one else gets hurt, no one else gets caught in the crossfire. Especially not the daughter of the man who took everything from me. He raised the letter opener, the sharp point aimed at her. He gave you the means to expose him, and in doing so, to expose the network he'd been investigating. But you can't expose him without exposing yourself to the dangers of that network. And I can't let you expose any of it. The network is still out there. Emily, more powerful than ever. They would silence you just as they would have silenced my mother, if she hadn't been silenced by someone else first. I've spent my life living in the shadows, watching them, gathering my own evidence. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to bring them down. Your grandfather's dying confession, inadvertently, gave me the final piece I needed. A confession that, once it's made public, will also expose the network, without putting you in harm's way. What are you talking about? Emily demanded, her mind racing, trying to find an escape, a way out of this nightmare. The true coded message wasn't in the style of the letters, Emily. It was in the timing, David said, a strange, almost triumphant light in his eyes. Your grandfather, in his final moments, sent you those letters, each containing a date, a time, and a location. Not for a future crime, but for a past one. He wasn't giving you clues to a killer. He was giving you clues to his confession. Each letter a piece of a puzzle leading you to this house, to this room, to that bird, and ultimately to the truth about Marion. But the final letter, the one you thought was a threat, the ticking clock, that was the key. It wasn't a threat to you. It was a message to me. Emily stared at him, bewildered. A message to you? Yes, he confirmed, a grim smile touching his lips. It was a dead man's switch. A time-release confession. Your grandfather, in his twisted guilt, set up a system. If I didn't intervene, if I didn't stop you from exposing everything prematurely, a final unencrypted message, detailing his crime and implicating the network, would be automatically sent to a specific, trusted journalist at midnight tonight. The journalist my mother used to work with. He wanted the truth out, no matter the cost, even if it meant sacrificing his own reputation posthumously. But he also knew the danger. He left it to me, to his former apprentice, to decide when and how that truth should be revealed. He trusted me to protect you, even from his own final act of penance. He stepped closer, the letter opener glinting. I've overridden his automated message now. The journalist won't receive it tonight. I've taken the confession, the evidence, everything he compiled about the network. I've spent years building my own case, adding to his work. And now I have everything I need to bring down the real criminals, the powerful people he was too afraid to confront when my mother was alive. But I can't let you interfere. You're too close. You're too vulnerable. You understand, don't you? Emily understood. David wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a man consumed by grief and a desperate need for justice, warped by decades of silence. He saw her as a loose end, a potential casualty in his meticulously planned war. You won't get away with this, David, Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady, even as her heart pounded. My grandfather also taught me to never give up, to always look for the hidden answer. As David lunged, the letter opener arcing towards her, Emily didn't scream or cower. Her grandfather's last lesson, the one she'd overlooked, flashed through her mind. Asterisk, always check the bindings. The real message is often hidden in plain sight. Asterisk. She hadn't just looked at the parchment. She'd felt the bird, the weight, the density. She'd opened it. But she hadn't dismissed the parchment itself. With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, Emily threw the carved wooden bird at David's face. It struck him with surprising force, momentarily stunning him. As he reeled back, groaning, Emily didn't run. Instead, she tore the slip of parchment she still held. It wasn't just a single word. It was a double layer. Her grandfather, the master of codes, would never be so simplistic. The word Marion was delicately written on the topmost layer. Beneath it, a second, even finer slip of paper had been meticulously glued. As the parchment tore, the hidden layer was revealed. This wasn't a confession. It was a key. Scrawled on this tiny, almost invisible slip was a series of coordinates, and below them a single cryptic instruction. Under the oldest oak. The real truth. David recovered, his eyes blazing with renewed fury. He saw what Emily was doing, the frantic tearing of the paper. "No! What have you found now, you little fool?" He lunged again, but Emily was already moving. She didn't have time to process the coordinates, only to recognize them for what they were. She bolted towards the open window, shards of glass scattering around her as she crashed through, landing awkwardly on the soft grass below. David was right behind her, shouting, his heavy footsteps thudding on the floorboards. But Emily was already running, the small torn slip of parchment clutched tightly in her hand. The coordinates blurred before her eyes, but she knew where the oldest oak was. It was in the forgotten corner of her grandfather's sprawling property, a place she hadn't visited since she was a small child. A place her grandfather had always told her was sacred ground. She ran, propelled by terror, by betrayal, and by a fierce, burning need to uncover the real truth, not just about Marion but about everything. The game was far from over. Her grandfather's ghost had led her not just to a confrontation, but to a final desperate race against time. The clock was still ticking, but now Emily held the power to reset it. The truth, the entire truth, lay buried, waiting for her under the oldest oak. And she would find it. She had to.